The hidden video. The morning air in the suburban neighborhood was crisp, and the sun's rays bathed the neatly trimmed lawns in a golden light. Birds chirped from the branches of tall trees, and the distant sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets as the school buses arrived to take the young ones to their respective schools. It was, on the surface, an idyllic place, a community where everyone knew everyone, and life seemed to move at an unhurried pace. The sidewalks were often dotted with friendly waves and casual greetings, and the familiar hum of everyday life provided a comforting sense of security. Yet beneath the polished exterior of this tranquil neighborhood, something was stirring that would change the course of several lives forever. It was on this ordinary morning that Officer Daniel Hayes found himself seated at a small, nondescript desk in the precinct, taking a brief respite from his usual duties. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights above and the occasional rustling of papers. Daniel took a sip of his coffee, glancing out the window at the rising sun, unaware that his day was about to take a sharp turn. Scrolling through his phone, Daniel absent-mindedly tapped through social media posts, watching the usual flood of videos, memes, and status updates from friends and acquaintances. But one post stood out, an unremarkable video that was beginning to go viral. It featured a small figure standing alone outside a school, holding a large, weathered piece of cardboard with bold black letters. The caption on the cardboard read, "Please help my family." Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen as he watched the video unfold. The image was grainy, clearly shot from a distance, but the words of the child were crystal clear. In the shaky footage, a little girl, no more than 8 years old, stood in front of her school, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation. The shaky camera captured her as she spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "My mommy is sick, and we don't have food," she said, her words nearly swallowed by the noise around her. "If you can help, please help. We're hungry, and I just want my mommy to get better." Daniel's heart sank as he watched her shift nervously, her small frame bracing itself against the wind. She looked around, almost as if to ensure no one was watching. Her bravery, despite her obvious fear, struck a chord deep within him. She wasn't asking for toys or new clothes. She was asking for help, for something far more basic. She was asking for survival. The video ended abruptly, leaving a haunting silence in its wake. Daniel rewatched the footage twice, then once more, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The girl's face was etched with a mixture of courage and sorrow, and her words kept echoing in his mind long after the video had ended. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a deep, unsettling weight to what she had said, and he knew he couldn't just ignore it. Instinctively, he forwarded the clip to his colleagues. Officer Maria Lopez, a tenacious investigator with a sharp eye for detail, and Officer Jordan Carter, a rookie who had been eager to prove himself. "We need to find her," Daniel wrote simply, before hitting send. His message was met with an immediate response from Maria, who shared Daniel's concern. They all agreed they couldn't let this slide, not after seeing the fear in the girl's eyes. They had no idea who she was or where she lived, but they knew one thing. The child in the video was asking for help in a way that couldn't be ignored. The time for questions was over. It was time for action. By the time their shift ended that day, the officers were in their unmarked car, parked a few blocks away from the school, scanning the area for any sign of the young girl. The parking lot was filled with the sounds of chattering students, the bell ringing to signal the end of the school day. But amid the chaos, they kept their focus, eyes scanning the crowd. The children streamed out of the school in groups, laughing and talking, their colorful backpacks bouncing with each step. It wasn't long before they saw her, standing near the edge of the crowd, clutching her tattered backpack as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her eyes, wide and alert, darted around as if searching for someone. Her pigtailed hair fluttered in the breeze, and her small figure stood out from the rest of the children, not because of any special feature, but because of the sorrowful yet determined energy that seemed to surround her. It was her. Her face was the same one from the video, and without a word, Daniel, Maria, and Jordan exchanged knowing glances. This was it, the beginning of something neither they nor the young girl could have anticipated. The officers followed her at a discreet distance as she walked, her pace steady and purposeful. The path she took was longer than they had expected, winding through the neat streets of suburban homes and into a part of town that seemed to be slowly falling apart. The pristine lawns and trimmed hedges soon gave way to cracked sidewalks, faded buildings, and unkempt lawns. Daniel frowned as he watched her continue down the road, her small feet barely making a sound against the asphalt. It didn't take long before the surroundings began to change, a transition from the well-kept homes to the kind of area that many people avoided, even during the day. She crossed streets with no hesitation, weaving in and out of alleys, as though she knew exactly where she was going. The officers, still a few steps behind, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of concern. This was a neighborhood few dared to venture into, and yet the girl walked with a quiet confidence that made it clear she had been here before. She wasn't afraid of the shadows. She was simply walking home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stopped in front of a building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. It was an old, run-down apartment complex, its windows cracked, and the once bright paint now chipped and peeling. The door to the building creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open, disappearing inside without a glance back. The officers stood still for a moment, exchanging looks. Maria's brow furrowed. "Should we go in?" she asked quietly, the tension in the air palpable. Daniel's voice was soft but firm. "We need to find out what's going on. We can't leave it like this." Jordan nodded, already moving toward the building. The three officers knew they couldn't just walk away. Whatever this little girl was hiding, they had to uncover it. They followed her inside, stepping into the darkness of the building, unsure of what they would find. As they climbed the stairs, their footsteps were the only sound in the empty halls. They arrived at the second floor and stood in front of the door the girl had entered moments before. It was then that the enormity of the situation hit them. They had no idea what was on the other side. What they did know was that a young girl, alone and seemingly without anyone else to turn to, was at the center of this mystery. As Daniel raised his hand to knock, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a case of poverty. No, something deeper was at play. And as they stepped forward into the unknown, they had no idea how much their lives would be changed by what lay behind that door. The long walk home. As the officers stood just outside the rundown apartment building, they exchanged glances, the weight of what they had witnessed settling on their shoulders. The girl's path had taken them deep into the heart of a neighborhood most people try to avoid, and they felt the pull of something larger at play. This wasn't just about helping a child. It was about uncovering the truth of what lay behind her journey and her bravery. The evening air had cooled, and the shadows grew longer as the last remnants of daylight clung to the horizon. The officers, despite their training and hardened experiences, were beginning to feel the emotional weight of what they had embarked on. They could no longer just be law enforcement. They were becoming part of this child's story, and that was something none of them had anticipated. As they followed the girl, the world around them started to shift. The houses and neatly manicured lawns of the more affluent neighborhoods had slowly transformed into something far less polished. The streets were narrower here, the sidewalks cracked and uneven, and the homes were no longer cared for with the same love and attention. They passed faded storefronts, broken windows, and graffiti-covered walls. Even the streetlights seemed worn out, barely casting a dim light onto the asphalt. It wasn't just the physical decay of the area that struck the officers. It was the feeling of neglect. The sense that something was wrong here, something that had been allowed to fester for too long, without anyone stepping in to fix it. The officers could see it all now, the disparity between the pristine suburbs and the reality of what many families faced in this forgotten part of town. The girl, however, seemed unaffected by the world around her. She walked with a quiet determination, her small figure unwavering as she moved down the cracked sidewalks. She didn't glance at the officers or look back to see if they were following her. Instead, her focus was solely on the path ahead. Her tattered backpack clung to her shoulders as she took each step, her posture still as straight as any adult would walk. Daniel couldn't help but feel a growing sense of respect for her, mixed with concern. She had an air of maturity about her, as though she had experienced more in her short years than anyone should have to. It wasn't just the act of walking home alone. It was how she did it, with a quiet resolve, almost as though she had walked this route 1,000 times before. Maria, riding beside Daniel, scanned the streets as they continued their surveillance from a distance. Her gaze drifted from one derelict building to another, her mind already processing what she was seeing. She had been a police officer for over 8 years, and in that time, she had seen many cases of hardship, neglect, and abuse. But this was different. The little girl, with her cardboard sign, and her plea for help, had sparked something in her. She felt a protective instinct she couldn't shake, and she knew they were close to something important. Jordan, the newest member of the team, was quieter than usual. As a rookie, he had yet to experience the raw side of policing, the kind that dealt not just with the law, but with the broken lives that so often slipped through the cracks. He had signed up to serve his community, to make a difference, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. For the first time, he felt unsure, not about his abilities as an officer, but about the larger forces at play in the world. What was it that had led this little girl to walk so far, to make such a dangerous trek alone? And why did it feel like they were heading into a place that no one else cared to look? As they continued down the street, the trio's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden turn of the girl. She veered off the main road and entered a narrow alleyway, lined with trash bins and broken-down cars. The officers slowed their pace, careful not to lose sight of her. The alley was dim, the air heavy with the smell of dampness and neglect. They followed her as she weaved through the narrow passage, her footsteps light but purposeful. It wasn't long before the alley opened up into a wide, desolate street. The buildings here seemed older, more rundown, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. This was not the kind of place a child should be walking through alone, and yet here she was, moving through it like she had walked this route for years. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he watched her. What was it about her that made her seem so accustomed to this environment? She didn't look scared. Far from it. She was moving with intent, heading toward an apartment complex that stood at the end of the street. The building was tall, its brick facade crumbling in places, the windows clouded with dust and grime. But it wasn't the condition of the building that caught the officer's attention. It was the way the girl approached it. She didn't hesitate as she approached the front door, reaching into her bag and pulling out an old key that looked too large for her tiny hands. It seemed almost absurd. The key was worn down from years of use, and yet it was the only tool she had to open the door to her home. She inserted the key into the lock with surprising precision, twisting it once, twice, before pushing the door open with a creak that echoed down the alley. The officers exchanged glances once more. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. They couldn't just stand by anymore. This wasn't some distant problem. This was happening now, and they were the only ones who could help. Without speaking, they exited the car, walking cautiously toward the building. The street, now eerily quiet, felt like a different world from the one they had just left behind. It wasn't just a matter of following a child anymore. It was a matter of uncovering a story that could change everything. As they approached the front door of the apartment building, Daniel's heart raced. He could already feel the weight of the moment. Whatever happened next would be a turning point for all of them. The door, unlocked and left ajar, seemed like an invitation. But what would they find inside? They stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the musty smell of neglect. The walls, once white, were now stained yellow from years of wear, and the floors creaked under their feet as they moved cautiously toward the stairs. The narrow staircase twisted upward, leading them to the second floor, where they knew the girl had gone. They could hear faint noises from the apartment, the sound of a door opening, the rustling of fabric, and their hearts pounded with anticipation. The officers stopped just outside the apartment door. From inside, they could hear the faint sound of a child's voice, but it wasn't enough to make them act immediately. This wasn't a situation they could rush into blindly. They had to be careful. Their role was to protect, not to intrude. With a final glance at each other, Daniel gave a subtle nod, signaling that they should move forward. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. There was no turning back now. A shocking discovery. The tension was palpable as the officers stood outside the door, their senses heightened, every sound magnified in the stillness of the building. The small creak of the wooden floorboards, the distant hum of traffic outside, and the faint echoes of a child's voice from within. It was all part of the unfolding mystery. The moment was delicate, like a fragile thread on the verge of snapping. None of them knew what they would find on the other side of that door, but they were committed to seeing it through. They had already come this far, and there was no turning back. Daniel raised his hand to knock, but before he could do so, the door creaked open just enough to allow a sliver of light to spill into the dim hallway. The small figure of the little girl appeared in the crack, her wide eyes gazing up at the officers. For a moment, she didn't speak, just stared at them with a mix of wariness and cautious hope. It was as though she was measuring them, deciding whether or not they were to be trusted. "Are you here to take my mommy away?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as if the question had been lodged deep in her chest, waiting to be asked. Her eyes flicked nervously from one officer to the next, her small body trembling slightly. Daniel crouched down to her level, his voice calm and reassuring. "No, sweetheart, we're not here to take anyone away. We just want to make sure you're all right. We saw your video, and we're here to help." He softened his tone, trying to ease the fear he saw in her face. For a long moment, the little girl just stood there, her grip on the door tightening, as though she was afraid to let go. The weight of her vulnerability hit the officers all at once, and they knew they couldn't afford to make any missteps. They had to gain her trust. Finally, the girl nodded slowly, stepping aside and motioning for them to come in. "You can see for yourself," she said, her voice a mixture of sadness and determination. She didn't seem to have any sense of what was safe or not. All she knew was that she had nothing left to lose. The officers stepped across the threshold, entering the apartment cautiously. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and disrepair. The dim light from a single flickering bulb overhead barely illuminated the room. The apartment was sparse, with only the barest of furniture, a worn-out couch that sagged in the middle, a table missing a leg, and a mattress on the floor in the corner of the room. Everything was old, used, and in desperate need of repair. But what caught the officer's attention most was the figure lying motionless on the mattress. A woman, perhaps in her early 30s, lay on the bed, her face pale and drawn. Her body was thin, and her breathing shallow, as if every breath took tremendous effort. The woman's frailty was impossible to ignore. Her very presence seemed to speak of someone who had long been struggling, caught in a cycle of illness and exhaustion. For a moment, the officers froze, their eyes darting to each other, silently communicating their concern. This wasn't just a simple case of neglect. This was something far more serious. But before they could act, the little girl's voice cut through the stillness. "That's my mommy," she said softly, her voice trembling with both pride and fear. "She's not dead. She's just tired." Her words were simple but held so much weight. This was her world. This frail woman, this empty apartment, and this young child who had no choice but to navigate it all on her own. Maria, the more experienced officer, was the first to step forward, her instincts kicking in. She knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse and examining her condition. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, her gaze distant and unfocused. Her lips parted, and her voice came out in a weak whisper. "Please, don't take her away." The words barely left her mouth, almost inaudible. Her eyes met Maria's, and for a fleeting moment, there was recognition. The woman was pleading for the officers to leave her daughter in peace, as though her very existence depended on her mother's presence, fragile as it was. Jordan, the rookie, stepped back to survey the apartment, his mind racing. It didn't take long for his gaze to fall upon the empty cupboards, the refrigerator with barely anything inside, and the pile of overdue bills stacked haphazardly on the table. The realization hit him hard. The family was struggling far beyond what anyone could imagine. The mother's illness, the lack of food, the financial ruin. It was all there in plain sight, woven together in a desperate, silent narrative. The little girl stood silently beside them, clutching her backpack to her chest, as if it were her only possession of any worth. Her eyes followed the officers as they moved around the apartment, watching them intently but not speaking. There was something heartbreaking about her stoic demeanor, the way she stood guard over her mother, trying to protect what little she had left. Maria gently touched the woman's shoulder, her expression softening. "Ma'am, we need to get you to a hospital. You're not well. Your daughter needs you to get better, okay?" Her voice was steady, but there was no hiding the compassion in her eyes. The woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and she whispered again, "Please, don't take her away." The officers could see the panic in her eyes, the fear that someone would come and take her daughter from her, as if her already fragile existence would shatter completely if that happened. The little girl stepped forward, her small hands clasping the edge of the bed. "She's all I have left," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, but full of an adult-like sadness. "I just want her to get better." Daniel's heart ached at the sound of her voice, and he felt the weight of the responsibility he had just taken on. This wasn't just about following a child home. It was about doing something to change the course of her life, to intervene before this situation spiraled even further. "I promise we won't take her away," Daniel said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're going to make sure she gets the help she needs. You don't have to worry about that." But as the words left his mouth, Daniel realized something. They weren't just here to help this family. They were here because, in a way, they had already become part of the story. The officers weren't simply doing their job. They were offering something even more essential, a lifeline. This was a turning point, not just for the little girl and her mother, but for the officers themselves. Maria stood up and quickly assessed the situation. "We need to get her to a hospital. Now," she said, pulling out her radio. "We need an ambulance, and we need it fast." While Maria arranged for the emergency services, Jordan, taking the initiative, left the apartment and went straight to a nearby grocery store. He returned minutes later, carrying bags full of food, canned goods, bread, vegetables, and fruit. He didn't have time to think about what he was buying. He simply grabbed what he could. Meanwhile, Daniel sat with the little girl, doing his best to keep her distracted. He talked to her about school, her favorite subjects, and her dream of becoming a doctor. It was a conversation meant to offer comfort, to show her that even in the midst of crisis, someone cared about her well-being. She smiled faintly when he mentioned becoming a doctor, her eyes lighting up as she spoke about how she wanted to help sick people just like her mommy. When the paramedics arrived, the little girl hesitated. She clung to her mother's side, tears streaming down her face. "Don't take her away," she pleaded, her voice cracking with fear. "I'll be good. I promise. I'll do better." Maria knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around the girl. "Sweetheart, your mommy needs to get better so she can be strong again. We'll make sure you're taken care of while she's getting help." The little girl sniffled and wiped her eyes, but she eventually nodded, her small hand releasing its grip on her mother. The paramedics moved in, preparing to lift the woman onto a stretcher. As they did, the girl stepped back, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. It was at that moment that Daniel realized the true extent of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a family struggling with illness and poverty. It was a family trying to survive in a world that had forgotten them. But they weren't alone anymore. Not while the officers were there. As the paramedics carried the woman away, The girl clung to Maria, her new protector. The officers knew that this was only the beginning. They had done something small, but it was enough to change the course of this family's life. And as they stood there, watching the ambulance pull away, they made a silent vow. They would be there for this family, every step of the way. A glimmer of hope. The city had already begun to settle into the quiet of night, but for the officers, there was no such respite. Their minds raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. The face of that brave little girl etched into their memories. They had seen things that had changed their understanding of the world. A child left to shoulder the weight of her mother's illness, a family living in squalor, and a community too often overlooked. Now, they were left to wonder, what could they do next? How could they ensure that this family would not be abandoned again? The ambulance carrying the mother had left the apartment building, leaving behind a silence that was almost deafening. The little girl, though exhausted, had slowly calmed down in the aftermath. Maria and Daniel, along with Jordan, had done what they could in that moment, but they knew this was just the beginning of something much larger. They couldn't just walk away now, not after seeing the hopelessness in the girl's eyes. They made sure that the little girl was taken to a local shelter that specialized in emergency housing for children and families in crisis. The officers had spoken to the shelter's staff beforehand, ensuring that they understood the urgency of the situation. It was clear that this was more than just a matter of homelessness. It was a matter of survival. But as they prepared to leave the shelter, something inside them felt unsettled. They knew that a roof over her head wasn't enough. They had to do more. They had to ensure that this little girl's future wasn't defined by her circumstances. Over the next few days, the officers kept in touch with the shelter, checking in on the girl, who was now settled into a temporary room. She seemed to be adjusting, though the weight of everything she had experienced was still clear in her eyes. They learned that her name was Emily, and that her mother, Sarah, had been suffering from an untreated illness for months. Without insurance or resources, they had fallen through the cracks, unable to get the help they desperately needed. But it wasn't just the mother's illness that had led to their downfall. It was a cascade of misfortune. Sarah's husband had left them years ago, and though she had tried to work, her condition made it impossible. Emily had done her best to care for her mother, cooking what little food they could afford, cleaning the apartment, and trying to keep the world at bay. The weight of her responsibility had been immense for someone so young, and it showed in the quiet, measured way she spoke about her life. The officers knew they couldn't change everything overnight, but they could help make a difference, piece by piece. Maria, driven by a sense of duty that was impossible to ignore, began researching medical programs that could offer Sarah the treatment she needed. She found a local charity that provided free health care to individuals in dire need, and she worked behind the scenes to get Sarah registered for an immediate consultation. The process was far from simple. There was a mountain of paperwork, countless phone calls, and more than a few roadblocks. But Maria wasn't one to give up. She knew that if anyone could push through the red tape, it was her. Meanwhile, Jordan took the initiative to start a fundraiser. He created an online page, sharing the story of Emily and her mother, and began reaching out to local businesses for donations. It wasn't just about the money, though it would help pay for medical bills, food, and rent. It was about raising awareness. It was about showing people that this wasn't just one family's struggle. It was a reflection of a much larger issue that many families faced. He shared the fundraiser with every person he knew, and soon, the donations began to trickle in. It wasn't much at first, but each dollar represented something far greater: hope. Daniel, with his calm demeanor and understanding nature, focused on Emily. He knew that she had endured far too much, and he wanted to be sure that she knew she wasn't alone. He spent hours with her, talking about her dreams and what she wanted to do with her life. It was clear that, despite everything, Emily was a bright and capable young girl. She spoke with a quiet passion about her dream of becoming a doctor, of helping people the way she had wanted to help her mother. Daniel encouraged her, telling her that nothing was impossible if she worked hard enough. He shared stories of people who had overcome hardships and succeeded, not because they were born into privilege, but because they believed in themselves and persevered. It wasn't easy for Emily to talk about her dreams at first. The scars of her past were still too fresh. But with time, she began to open up, and soon she was smiling again, her eyes alight with the spark of hope she had long since lost. As the days passed, Sarah's condition began to improve. The charity clinic was able to provide her with medication, and though she wasn't fully recovered, she was able to sit up on her own for the first time in weeks. It was a small victory, but to Emily and Sarah, it meant the world. For the first time in a long while, they felt as though they could breathe. But the road ahead was still long. They had a long way to go before they could truly say they were out of the woods. The apartment was still in disrepair, and they were behind on rent. The money from the fundraiser was coming in, but it wasn't enough to cover all of their expenses. Still, it was a start. And with the support of the shelter, the officers, and the local community, Sarah and Emily slowly began to rebuild their lives. The officers didn't stop there. They continued to check in regularly, making sure that Emily and her mother were safe and receiving the help they needed. They connected them with a local food bank and helped them apply for government assistance. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. And in the end, it was what made all the difference. Months passed, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Emily, once a frightened and lonely child, was now thriving. She had been enrolled in a local school where she excelled in her studies, particularly in science. She was surrounded by people who cared for her, teachers who recognized her potential, and friends who saw her for the bright, capable person she was. The pain of her past was still there, but it no longer defined her. Sarah, too, had begun to regain her strength. She was working part-time at a local coffee shop, and though it wasn't much, it gave her a sense of purpose. More importantly, it gave her a sense of independence. She no longer relied solely on others for help. She was taking charge of her life once again. One day, a few months after their initial meeting, Daniel, Maria, and Jordan found themselves standing at the door of Emily and Sarah's apartment once more. They had come to check in, to see how things were progressing. The apartment had been cleaned, the broken furniture replaced with new items from the fundraiser. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. When the door opened, Emily stood there with a huge grin on her face. "Come in. Mom's making dinner tonight," she said, her voice filled with excitement. It was a far cry from the fearful, withdrawn girl the officers had met weeks ago. She had a newfound energy about her, and it was contagious. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by the aroma of freshly cooked food, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness they had found when they first visited. Sarah, though still recovering, was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up and smiled warmly. "It's not much, but it's a start," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The officers stood in the doorway, feeling a sense of pride swell within them. They had been part of something extraordinary, a small but crucial piece of this family's journey. They had helped them find hope when they had none left. Before leaving, as they were preparing to say their goodbyes, Emily handed each officer a drawing she had made. It was a picture of 3 stick-figure police officers standing alongside her and her mother, smiling in front of their home. Above the picture, she had written, in shaky letters, "Thank you for everything. You saved us." It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. The officers stood in silence for a moment, each of them fighting back the lump in their throats. In that instant, they understood what it meant to be more than just officers of the law. They were part of a family, part of a community, and they had helped to bring about a change that was greater than any single one of them could have accomplished alone. And as they left, they knew one thing for sure. They had made a difference, not just in the lives of Sarah and Emily, but in their own lives as well. This was what it meant to serve, not just as protectors, but as people who cared, people who saw the humanity in others and fought for their right to have a better life. It was a lesson that would stay with them forever. The transformation. The weeks that followed Sarah's discharge from the hospital were filled with small victories, each one a step closer to rebuilding the life that had once seemed so hopeless. The officers continued to check in on Emily and her mother, and each visit revealed a bit more progress, a bit more light. There was something powerful about seeing how the kindness of a few had managed to spark a change so profound. But the journey wasn't over. For Sarah and Emily, it had just begun. In the months following Sarah's recovery, Emily began to shine in a way that even the officers hadn't expected. Her natural curiosity, the hunger for knowledge that had been so dimmed by her responsibilities at home, was now able to flourish. She threw herself into her schoolwork, staying after class to ask questions, eager to learn about anything that could one day help her accomplish her dream of becoming a doctor. Emily's grades improved drastically. Teachers noted her sharp mind, her unwavering determination, and her quiet, unassuming leadership. The child who had once struggled to carry the weight of her family's survival was now focused on her future, with a resilience that inspired everyone around her. Sarah, too, had slowly started to regain control of her life. After years of being caught in a cycle of illness and neglect, she was now strong enough to begin working again. At first, it was only a few shifts at the local coffee shop. She worked the counter, made lattes, and served pastries to customers who often complimented her kindness. But for Sarah, it wasn't just about the job. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself. It was about knowing she could stand on her own again, that she was no longer dependent on charity, but capable of rebuilding her life. But the road had not been without its hurdles. One night, a heavy rainstorm left the roof of their apartment leaking. It was a blow to their already tight budget. The small space that they had worked so hard to make comfortable now seemed to be slipping through their fingers. The roof wasn't something they could afford to fix themselves, and while Sarah was trying her best to juggle work and looking after Emily, the burden was beginning to weigh her down again. She tried to patch up the leaks with old towels and blankets, but she couldn't help feeling defeated. When the officers learned of the latest setback, they immediately sprang into action. They knew that Sarah and Emily were on the verge of a breakthrough. They couldn't let this obstacle send them spiraling back into the darkness they had fought so hard to escape. Daniel, Maria, and Jordan had become more than just officers to this family. They had become their support system, their lifeline in a world that had repeatedly shown them no mercy. Maria reached out to a local nonprofit that specialized in home repairs for low-income families. The group had connections with contractors who volunteered their time, and within a matter of days, the roof was fixed. The community had rallied once again to ensure that Sarah and Emily would not face another setback, no matter how small it seemed. This was the kind of help that made all the difference, the kind of compassion that went beyond simple charity and into the realm of community. By the time the roof was fixed, Emily had turned a corner. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. Her natural intelligence and determination were noticed by a local scholarship program for students in need, and she was awarded a full scholarship to attend a prestigious summer science camp. This opportunity was not just a chance for her to explore her interests further. It was a gateway to a future she had long dreamed of but never thought possible. Emily had always wanted to become a doctor, but now she was beginning to see a tangible path to that dream. The day she received the letter informing her of the scholarship, Emily burst into tears. She held the envelope tightly in her hands, staring at the words on the paper as if they were a lifeline. Sarah, who had been struggling to keep it together, held Emily close, unable to speak for a moment. The weight of the moment settled between them, a quiet understanding passing between them. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. Emily's dreams were no longer out of reach. They were within her grasp. The officers were among the first to know about Emily's achievement. When they visited that evening, they found her grinning from ear to ear, the letter still clutched tightly in her hands. She had been waiting for the perfect moment to tell them. And now that moment had arrived. "You did it," Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. I knew you had it in you." Emily blushed, shaking her head. "I couldn't have done it without you. You all helped me believe that I could." Maria and Jordan were just as excited. Maria pulled her into a hug, her eyes misting over. "This is just the beginning, Emily. The world is yours now." For Sarah, the news was just as overwhelming. She had watched her daughter struggle for so long, had seen her carry burdens far too heavy for a child. But now, for the first time, she saw hope. Real, tangible hope for their future. It wasn't just the scholarship that meant so much. It was the fact that Emily was no longer afraid of her future. She could dream freely now, without the weight of uncertainty on her shoulders. The officers had been there at every turn, when the roof needed fixing, when Emily had her first success at school, when Sarah was in the hospital, and now, they were there to celebrate with them. They were no longer just law enforcement officers to this family. They were part of their journey, a part of their story. As the summer camp approached, Emily prepared eagerly. She packed her bags with books, notebooks, and a hopeful heart, ready to meet new friends and dive deeper into the world of science. The camp would be a transformative experience for her, one that would shape her into the person she would become in the future. While Emily was away, Sarah continued her work at the coffee shop, and with the help of the community, the apartment was slowly becoming a home in the truest sense. The clutter was replaced with new furniture, and the once bare walls now held pictures of Emily's artwork, photos of family outings, and even a few flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. Sarah found herself smiling more often, the stress of survival slowly replaced by the joy of living. The change wasn't just physical, it was internal too. Sarah had learned to rely on others, to accept help when it was offered, and to understand that it was okay to lean on a community when times were tough. For so long, she had thought that asking for help was a sign of weakness, but now she knew it was the opposite. It was strength. It was resilience. It was the very thing that had allowed her to stand back up after everything that had knocked her down. The officers continued to check in, offering their support and encouragement as they watched Sarah and Emily grow. They had become family in every sense of the word. The bond they had formed was unspoken, yet stronger than anything they had experienced in their professional lives. They knew they had made a difference in these two lives, but they also knew that the journey wasn't over. It would never be over. Emily, now filled with a renewed sense of purpose, set her sights on a future where she could give back, where she could help others the way she had been helped. Sarah, no longer trapped in a cycle of fear and exhaustion, began to dream for the first time in years. And as for the officers, they found themselves renewed in their mission, reminded of the incredible power of compassion, community, and the belief that every life mattered. Together, they had transformed something broken into something beautiful. And in that beauty, they had found hope. Hope that one day, no one would have to face their struggles alone. A community united. The transformation that had taken place in Emily and Sarah's lives was nothing short of miraculous. The journey had been long, difficult, and at times heartbreaking, but it was also filled with moments of triumph. The officers, Daniel, Maria, and Jordan, knew that they had played a pivotal role, but as they watched Emily and Sarah flourish, they realized that this wasn't just a victory for one family. It was a victory for the entire community, a reminder that when people come together, they can create something extraordinary. The neighborhood, which had once seemed fractured, now felt connected in ways that no one could have predicted. The ripple effect of Sarah and Emily's story spread far beyond the walls of their small apartment. People who had once kept to themselves began to reach out, offering support, resources, and kindness. The transformation wasn't just about fixing a roof or providing medical care. It was about changing the mindset of an entire community. People began to realize that the struggles of one family were the struggles of all. And when one person lifts themselves up, the entire community rises with them. As the months passed, Emily's scholarship for the summer science camp became the talk of the town. Local businesses, inspired by her story, began to offer support for her ongoing education. A small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping low-income students in the area heard about Emily's potential and offered to match her scholarship with additional funding for her college education. This wasn't just about a little girl's dream of becoming a doctor. It was about the community's belief in the power of education, the potential that every child held, regardless of their background. The support didn't stop with Emily. Word had spread that Sarah had not only overcome her illness, but was also thriving in her job at the coffee shop. Her journey was an inspiration to many in the neighborhood, and soon, customers who came in for their morning coffee were also leaving tips for Sarah, knowing that they were helping a family that had been through so much. The coffee shop became more than just a place for caffeine. It became a symbol of resilience and hope. The officers, too, found themselves changed by the experience. Maria, who had always been driven by her desire for justice, had come to understand that true justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about making sure that people had access to the resources and opportunities they needed to succeed. She started to advocate for programs that would connect local families in crisis with the services they needed, working with the city council to create outreach initiatives that would support families like Emily and Sarah's. Her efforts led to the establishment of a new initiative aimed at helping children from underserved neighborhoods gain access to educational opportunities, and she worked tirelessly to make sure that every child had a chance to thrive, just as Emily had. Jordan, the rookie officer who had been unsure of his place in the world of law enforcement, found himself inspired by the journey he had witnessed. He saw firsthand how kindness and compassion could transform lives, and he began to work with local charities to coordinate community-driven initiatives. One of his most notable achievements was organizing a community-wide food drive that provided meals to struggling families in the area. The drive was a massive success, with neighbors and local businesses coming together to donate food, clothing, and household items to those in need. Daniel, who had been the first to share the video that had sparked this entire journey, found himself reflecting deeply on the true meaning of service. He had always believed that being a police officer meant enforcing the law and protecting the public. But through his involvement with Emily and Sarah, he came to realize that the role of an officer wasn't just about responding to crime. It was about being a part of the fabric of the community, about helping people in their most vulnerable moments and empowering them to rebuild their lives. He made a commitment to spend more time engaging with the community, getting to know the families he served, and offering a listening ear when people were in need. One of the most touching moments in this entire journey came when Emily returned from her summer science camp. The experience had changed her in ways that no one could have predicted. She came back more confident, more determined, and with a newfound sense of purpose. She was no longer just the little girl who had asked for help on a cardboard sign. She was a young woman with big dreams, someone who had already begun to make a mark on the world. The community rallied around her, welcoming her back as one of their own. The day she returned to the coffee shop where Sarah worked was a celebration. Emily walked through the door, her eyes sparkling with excitement, and immediately the entire cafe erupted into applause. Customers who had been regulars for months stood and cheered, clapping for the girl who had defied the odds, the girl who had worked hard and made it to where she was. Emily, overwhelmed by the love and support, could barely hold back her tears. It wasn't just a celebration of her success, it was a celebration of the community that had helped her get there. As she approached the counter, Sarah looked up, a proud smile on her face. "I knew you'd make it," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always had it in you, Emily." The officers, who had been invited to join the celebration, watched the scene unfold with tears in their eyes. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, the vision of a community united, where people didn't just look out for themselves, but looked out for one another. It was the realization that their small acts of kindness had sparked something far larger than they had ever imagined. But it wasn't just about what they had done. It was about what the community had done together. It was about the countless individuals who had stepped up to help Emily and Sarah, who had opened their hearts and their wallets to give a family in need a second chance. It was about neighbors offering a helping hand when no one else would, businesses donating time and resources to ensure the family's survival, and even strangers who had heard their story and decided to lend a hand. As the celebration continued, Daniel, Maria, and Jordan stood back and reflected on the journey they had taken. They had seen the worst of humanity in many ways: crime, neglect, violence. But this was different. This was a reminder that for all the pain and hardship that existed in the world, there was also love, kindness, and the capacity for great change. It was a reminder that, at its core, their work was not just about solving problems. It was about bringing people together, about showing them that no one was ever truly alone. In the months that followed, Emily continued to excel in school, earning top marks and scholarships that would carry her through high school and beyond. Sarah, once frail and fearful, now looked ahead with confidence, knowing that she had the strength to face whatever challenges came her way. They both had come so far, and the community had come with them. One day, as Emily prepared for her high school graduation, the officers paid a visit to her and Sarah. They'd brought with them a gift, a framed photo of the three of them, standing together with Emily and Sarah in front of their now fully repaired apartment, a symbol of all they had overcome. The photo was a token, a reminder of the power of community and compassion. "I'm so proud of you, Emily," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made all of us proud." Emily, now a young woman on the brink of her future, smiled warmly. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You all changed my life. You showed me that I could be more than my circumstances, and because of you, I know I can make a difference." As the sun set on that perfect day, the officers knew that they had done more than just solve a case. They had helped a family rise from the ashes of hardship and build a future full of promise. And in doing so, they had witnessed the incredible power of a community united. A community that believed in the strength of compassion, the importance of hope, and the limitless potential of every person. It was a story of transformation, of healing, and of love, one that would remain etched in their hearts forever. And as they walked away, knowing that they had made a lasting difference, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had seen firsthand how small acts of kindness could create monumental change. And it was this truth, more than anything else, that would continue to inspire them in their work for years to come.